psychology and cognitive science, and a master's degree in second language studies. Bill has taught EFL for more than 10 years in Italy, Ecuador, Japan, and Brazil, and loves learning second languages himself. As some quick housekeeping before we get started, we will be having a short Q&A session towards the end of this webinar. So please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box at any time during the talk. Any questions that we do not get to during the session will be responded to via email as soon as possible. And the webinar session will also be recorded and available shortly after the session in case you would like to share it with colleagues. And now I'm happy to pass it over to Bill.
This thing, which is, I think, much more important now in the time of this pandemic, where many of us are not having classes, but this is even appropriate during the time when we are having in-person classes. And this is something that I've been looking into for a bunch of years. I was a English teacher myself for 15 years, working in classrooms in various countries around the world and in the United States. And I also, as Jen mentioned, I went to do my PhD in psychology because I wanted to learn about how people learn things and how memory works. And I wanted to focus that on language. So my people like Bob de Keyser and Nick Ellis were sort of my heroes in this because they kind of crossed over between the areas of cognitive psychology, learning, and language learning in a second language. So that's kind of the focus of my talk, which is about how we can help people get to a point of the proficiency where they are hitting their target. Now, I'm going to go backwards a little bit and try to figure out, first of all, why learning a second language is so difficult and takes so long. And many of you know this, most of you probably, because you are obviously very proficient English speakers now, and many of you are not, were not born in English-speaking countries or not learning language from the time that you were born. And so you are probably in the top 1% of the world of instructed language learning, because most of the time people fail to achieve a high level of proficiency, and they fail to hit a level of listening where they could understand a talk like this. So congratulations, you made it, and now you're trying to get your students to make it there. One of the reasons that, let me talk about some of the reasons that learning a second language is so hard. First of all, it's a large vocabulary. Most native speakers know about 10,000 words or more in their native language. And that's a lot of things. That's many little pieces to learn. And as we know, there's always new words when you're learning a second language. Even at an advanced level of proficiency, you're constantly discovering new words. So there's a large vocabulary to learn. There's also combinations of those words, which multiplies this by many times. So it's not just like the meaning of those 10,000 words is all you need. Sometimes the meaning of those words combines in a way that's not predictable. So, for example, log in is something that I had to do to get on this website. A log has many different meanings, and logging in has a particular meaning. If you know the word of log and you know the word of in, it doesn't really help you to understand what logging in means. So that's just one example of the many, many complexities of a language like English that uses conventional combinations or collocations. So you have to learn all of those too. You can't just learn the meanings and predict them. One of the reasons that, another reason that second language is very difficult to pick up is because early on, before we're born, we are beginning to listen to the sounds around us in our mother's bodies and in the voices that are in her or in other people around us. And those are in usually one language, but in some cases, many languages. As you are born, and in those first 2 years of life, as you begin to acquire your first language, you are very sensitized to those sounds, and you become less sensitive to sounds of other languages. And let me illustrate. So in English, we have a sound P, which is aspirated. That means that there's a little bit of extra breath that comes out after the sound leaves your lips. And in early times, like when you are 2 months old, 3 months old, there are many other versions of that P phoneme that you are able to perceive. The version from Korea, the version from Spain, the version from Japan. They're all slightly different in the way that they sound. And you as a baby are sensitive to all of those pieces, all of those ways of expressing human sounds. But soon you become much more sensitive to your first language sounds that are in your environment all the time, and you begin to drop that perception of other kinds of sounds that would be possible in other languages. This is called categorical perception. So now, after 2 years or so, if you hear a Spanish P or a Japanese P or a Korean P, it sounds like an English P to you. You can't pick up on those differences. So everything falls into the category of English P. Now, there's a very good reason for this. That's because as we develop this categorical perception in our first language phonology, we become very fast, very automatic, and very expert at listening to those sounds and parsing them into words and understanding language. So this is a great advantage for us, and this is one of the things that makes us native speakers of our languages. It comes at a cost, and that cost is that we are no longer sensitive to all those sounds of P, and we are no longer able to hear a lot of the sounds that are around us in other languages that we are not really studying, or that we're not around at that time. So as an adult, we have to get over this. It's not a problem. It's a feature. It's a great advantage to have a first language. And now we need to break into another language, knowing that our brains have become less sensitive to those other kinds of sounds. So we need to give a lot of time and effort to that. And it's challenging for people once they become adults, but not impossible. Now let's move on to just talking about grammar. Even languages that are highly related, like English and German or Spanish and French, They came from common origins. They have very similar grammars, but also very different in some cases. So there's a lot to learn, even for there's a lot for us to learn. We can't just transfer that grammar knowledge over from our first language to our second. And as languages become more and more distant from one another, those differences become greater and greater. So going from English to Japanese or Japanese to English is a bigger step. It takes longer to acquire that language, if it's a great language distance, than a one that's closer together, like English and Spanish. And that's natural because it's not only phonology, but it's about grammar and vocabulary and marking of semantics and all of these things that we study in linguistics. So all of these tasks take a huge amount of time. If any of you have heard ideas about how long it takes to acquire languages, I think you'd be surprised to see how long it takes just to jump one level. So these are data from the Global Scale of English that Pearson has put together. So as you can see, if somebody starts on the top row here at CEFR level below A1, basically an absolute beginner, to get to the A1 level, let's say the middle of the A1 level, is going to take a fast learner 95 hours and a slow learner 480 hours. So let's say on average, it takes about 250 hours of language instruction or time on task in order to just get to the middle of the A1 level. And as you can see, from going from A1 to A2 takes maybe a slightly less amount of time, or about the same. A2 to B1 now, we're going up into about 400 hours on average. B1 to B2 is something more than 500 or 600 hours. And B2 to C1 is something between something about 1,500 hours. So literally to get up to the C1 level is going to take you something close to 8,000 to 10,000 hours of study. And we know that in 5 hours a week in a classroom, we're never going to get to that point. So 5 hours a week is only 260 hours per year. So we have to kind of admit defeat from the start and know that just the classroom instruction time, excuse me, is not going to be enough to get students to high proficiency. Now, I've assembled a few other ideas about how not to master a second language, meaning what are the things that we've tried that we know will result in failure to acquire second languages at a high level of proficiency. So first of all, not enough time. Second, a grammar-based syllabus and a focus on accuracy. So we know that that's actually not how people learn. In many cases, people try to teach them only correct language and have them repeat only correct language so that they would never make errors. And the assumption was that if you only learn correct stuff and never learn incorrect stuff, you will go straight from your beginning to your end point without making all those errors. And we can avoid a lot of the problems that are grammatical errors, for example. We know that that's not true now. And focusing on accuracy doesn't really help because we are in a communicative language world now. In the past, as language curriculum directors or instructors or textbook writers, we put a lot of emphasis on things that were easier to test rather than the things that were the most effective to learn or to help us break into the second language. So grammar, vocabulary, accuracy, those are very easy to test and very easy to check, but they don't really tell us very much about proficiency level and changes in proficiency over time. Achievement testing would be what we consider to be testing of material that is studied. So end of the chapter test, a list of vocabulary, some grammar points that you have drilled people with over and over again. If you can, many people can become very successful at these and they get 100% on their end of the chapter tests. However, that it's a false impression of proficiency gain because all of that knowledge doesn't necessarily transfer into our conversation or our processing of the second language, and certainly not into our general proficiency. So we can't pretend that just mastering the content in a book that says it's at the B1 level means that at the end of it, okay, you've achieved the B1 level. Now it's time to move into the low B2 level. book because you've already mastered everything in B1. It's obviously it's not true. So we need to abandon this idea that achievement testing is a proxy for, or is a substitute for true testing of proficiency. In the past, teachers guided learning. They were the kind of masters of it. The textbooks would often provide the syllabus. So people would imagine that the input that they needed was what was in the textbook. That becomes the syllabus or the curriculum. And then teachers are supplementing that with other materials. And that's everything that you need. And I'll talk about ways in which that's perhaps an incorrect assumption. And finally, I'd like to talk about group conversation. Now, when I was a kid, we didn't really have much chance to learn a foreign language by speaking in small groups. And then later, when I became a language teacher, this was a very encouraged and fantastic practice to get people to use the language in small groups in conversation. It's better than not doing it, but they may not always be as focused enough as we need them to be useful. So it's good to have these opportunities, but they're not always enough. Sometimes we just put people in groups, we give them a task. We can't, as teachers, monitor everything that's going on in all the groups simultaneously. So we sort of hope that something good is happening. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of conversation, a lot of interaction. We have to just sort of hope that something good is going on there. And I'd like to point out that there are other ways that we can also focus attention on more guided practice. So the goals here in my mind are to build lifelong learners, knowing that as teachers we have to give up that control. We can't provide them with enough input because we'll never give them the amount of time on task that they need. We have to guide them in their self-directed learning, knowing that that's probably going to be about 90% of what they learn is things that they learn on their own, outside of the textbook and outside of your classroom. So we admit that and we accept it and we encourage it. Repetition is something that has been a little bit lost in the communicative approach, and I'd like to focus on that for a couple of my points here. I'll talk about that more. And focusing on the high impact areas of the second language. We already talked about what people have focused on in the past: grammatical accuracy, error-free learning, learning vocabulary, and written or reading English rather than spoken or listening. So these are the areas that I'd like to focus on. I'll give an example of these, of one of these kinds of problems that has come a long way. So first of all, this is a very positive message here because back in the old days, when people were in second language classrooms, this is actually what they looked like. Now, I'm not old enough to have existed only in black and white, but when I was in school, this is pretty much what my classroom looked like. And the teacher, it was what we called a teacher-fronted classroom. So the teacher was there at the front all the time. Those desks don't move for people to get into groups and collaborate in any way. And they're kind of sitting there, taking in material, studying, writing. And that was the old method for how somebody would learn a foreign language. And I think in some places you can still see vestiges of this. When I went, when I was in high school in the United States, I studied French my first year. And then the second year, we got a textbook that had a tape recorder and cassette tapes that accompanied the textbook. And suddenly, I could hear real French, or French that was spoken by French people, and not just the bad French that was spoken by my teacher. He didn't really even speak French. So the input suddenly changed from being only him to some cassette tapes of some very artificial French, but it was much better than just listening to Brother Rinkins with his very limited French. So suddenly we were hearing French voices and accents, and we could imitate them. And that was a good advantage that we didn't have. Later, language laboratories became quite popular, and you can see this is an example of an old one where they've got the reel-to-reel tape. You've got a microphone, you can do exercises, you can talk into the microphone and make recordings. And so this was an advantage in not only are you listening, like on the cassette tape example, but now you can also speak. Unfortunately, you're speaking to no one because nobody ever listened to your recordings in most of these cases. But you could hear yourself. That was nice. And it would give you some additional outside practice outside of the classroom to do some language practice. At around the same time, videos became popular, and then the world became slightly more globalized, and suddenly we could get videos from other countries or movies from other places. And we had now not just the artificial English that was built with textbooks on tapes, but we could suddenly hear material that was intended for native speakers of that language. When I was studying French, I never saw a French newspaper except the one that I had. I had one newspaper that was from France that I studied over and over again because it was all I had access to before the internet. And I never saw television programs or movies in French because they just didn't exist in my environment. Well, now you could get access to all of those things. And then obviously when DVDs came along, they made it much easier to stop the action, to go back a few seconds, to skip chapters, to put on subtitles in not only one language, but maybe in another language. So if I were studying Japanese, I could watch a Japanese movie and look at the subtitles in English, or I could look at an English language movie with the subtitles in Japanese. So that was actually quite a good advantage. So this really went far beyond where we had started. And finally, we ended up in a place where people have access to a lot of material. And I'm using this example of Friends because a couple of years ago when I was in Argentina, I was in a restaurant and there was a waitress there who spoke really good English. I complimented her on it, and I talked to her and I said, "How did you learn English so well?" And she said, "Friends." And I was like, "What?" She said, "Yeah, Friends, the TV show." And I would just watch it over and over again. And I loved some of the characters, and I liked to try to understand the jokes. And I wanted to speak like Phoebe. And so people were using self-access now to get something that was definitely not in their classroom and not in their textbook. And they found it funny. They found it interesting. And so they spent many, many hundreds of hours doing it. And so she's an example of someone that used something. It wasn't English language materials. It wasn't materials meant for learners. It was a TV show that became very popular here in the States. And she was accessing it over and over again by herself to break into the phonological system, to hack her way into the sound system of English, of American English, so that she could now speak more fluently and understand a lot of other things. So it was a fantastic example of someone who could, she had never left Argentina, by the way. She had learned everything while she was there in Buenos Aires. So listening is an example of a place where we have come incredibly far. Right now, on the internet, you have an infinite amount of L2 content, not just English, but many languages. You can look at subtitles and translations. You can even look at things that are in your own language and then kind of see a translation into the second language, or see things that have been subtitled or dubbed into your language. It's mostly free. It's available on phones and on computers. It can be replayed, slowed down, stopped. So all of those nice things that came along with DVDs are now available for free in more material than you can listen to in your entire life for the rest of your life. So suddenly we have this great input compared to what I had when I was starting to learn French, and all we had was those cassette tapes. Another contrast is that listening and these materials are showing us that listening is for communication. It's not a way of just pushing material into my head from the textbook, like those cassette tapes did. So now we have a fantastic resource in the internet and on things like YouTube. Now, for speaking, we don't have quite as much. What we would like to have is this kind of like artificial intelligence, almost like a best friend, like somebody who has infinite patience, who never gets tired of talking to you, who never gives wrong feedback, who always gives only the amount of feedback that you would like, And so eventually I think we're going to get to a place where we do have these kind of intelligent tutoring systems for speaking in a foreign language. We don't quite have that yet, but we certainly have a lot more opportunities for conversation with people on Facebook and all these other platforms that allow us to interact over the internet, and on FaceTime on the phone, and even many other tools on there. So it's not zero, but we're much more limited than what we have in listening. The automatic feedback is not quite as good as we would like it to be yet. And we have a lot of opportunities for recording ourselves and for listening to what we sound like. Compared to the past. So we're not as far in speaking as we are in listening, but I think we're getting there relatively quickly. And as technology companies like Pearson are engaging in this, we need a lot of help from teachers and language school directors too, to help us do this, because you're not losing your jobs because of this. You're actually becoming more valuable. Here are the ways that I think you can help your learners to chart their course to proficiency using a lot of self-access tools. So self-access, planning and strategy. Again, this is from the perspective of learners. So you're getting them to accept the idea of self-access, of planning or having a strategy for what they're trying to learn, of self-assessment, of deliberate practice or thoughtful practice, of seeking guidance on these key areas, and of formal assessment. So I'll talk about each of these in turn. The first is about self-access. So as teachers, as program directors, we need to give up control over the student learning, knowing that 90% of it has to happen outside of the classroom, and that it will happen in ways which are unpredictable and not necessarily structured and not tied to the program of learning that we have. So we know that people will do this, and that's fine. We have to give up that control. We never really had the control anyway. We're encouraging out of class practice in areas of their own interest and need. In some cases, people don't have real needs in a second language. They have no economic resources to do a study abroad program and be on a homestay. Well, they can pretend to have that need. And they can imagine that in September, they're going to get off the plane in Kiev, and they're going to need to speak Ukrainian and rent an apartment and get in a taxi or an Uber and do all these communicative tasks. So they can just imagine needs rather than actually have them. I don't want to use that word need very freely, but imagined needs are just as good as real ones in many cases. So one of the ways that we would encourage people to explore these needs and explore what they will have, what language they would have, what language they need to have in order to be in these situations, is to check out things like the GSE Teacher Toolkit. And this is a free tool that was created by Pearson on the internet, and I will share my screen. And I'm going to switch over from the presentation to the Teacher Toolkit. And Jen, would you mind putting the URL for the Teacher Toolkit into the chat, please, while I'm talking? So this is something that comes as a result of an extensive amount of corpus linguistics and data analysis, and also making a nice interface for people to use. It's not only for teachers, I think it's for learners too. And what you can see are three areas of information. There are learning objectives, there's grammar, and there's vocabulary. Learning objectives are like tasks. So you're asking, you're showing people what are the various kinds of tasks that people should be able to do at particular levels in particular skills. So I've selected here adult learners, and I'm going to choose the skill from language skills. There's also communicative categories, but I'm going to talk about just speaking. And so these are filters that I'm putting on. And as you can see, this slider here is a filter for GSE level, or place on the CEFR scale. So the selected range here is 43 to 51 on the global scale of English, which is the B1. And so what I'm going to see here are learning objectives for adult learners, GSE levels 43 to 51 in speaking. And so I've just chosen to show the results, and now it's giving me a set of all of the tasks and as you can see, there are 10 pages of these tasks that are things that are at the level, at the B1 level in speaking for adult learners. And you can see each of these. You can drill down to them in some cases and find more details. I'm not going to focus on the learning objectives here because I'm going to focus on vocabulary. So now I've switched tabs over to vocabulary, and I'm going to look for nouns and verbs. And I'm going to focus on cultures and folk festivals and customs and traditions and things like that. So again, these are all filters that I'm just adding. So instead of giving me hundreds of pages of information, this will just give me a small amount of information here. All right, and okay, so I had to click on show results. And so now I've got a list of vocabulary here that are all words that are kind of related to these topics. You can click on these and hear, you can click on them and hear pronunciations in North American and UK English. And so this is a narrowed down list of vocabulary related to these kinds of topics. So as someone might be interested in something like folklore and traditions, they can explore those topics on their own through the teacher toolkit and find vocabulary that they would not be able to find very easily in a dictionary or in some other kind of online resource. So this is one way that we can encourage learners to explore their own language by semantic fields and find things that they're interested in, which may not be in our syllabus or in the program of study that we've planned for them. So I'm going to go back to my presentation now. So we've talked first of all about people being systematic and exploring themselves, exploring the world for themselves through self-access. The next thing is to be systematic about your strategy. It doesn't have to be completely systematic. It might just be random sometimes, but we need to have people know what they're trying to do. If they're just clicking on links on the internet for 4 hours a day, that's not going to be an effective learning strategy. They need to have at least some plan of what they would like to be learning at any particular moment. So it has to be conscious meaning they know what they're doing. It has to be self-directed. Again, this is not something, we don't tell people, go to this YouTube site and watch this. You're asking them to spend that 90% extra of their time learning this language in a way that's aligned with their own interests and needs or perceived needs or imagined needs. So it's self-directed. It's got nothing to do with your classroom or your syllabus, and it's documented. So you need to have them keep records of what they're learning, of what they're accessing, focus on what they found difficult, where they were able to find success, what they learned was missing, or what they discovered that they already knew. So in many of these areas, we're really just focusing on them becoming conscious, lifelong learners that are willing to take some responsibility for their own learning. And this documenting or keeping access of to records is key. Just like in a lot of the places where we go on the internet. I do a lot of shopping on Amazon.com. I like the fact that it keeps track of all of my orders, so I know what I've ordered. I can look at my reviews and remember, oh, I bought this, but I didn't like it. I bought this and it was fantastic. I can see how much it cost. Those kinds of records are key for us to begin developing as learners ourselves in second languages. What did we study? What did we discover were words that we didn't know? We need to recycle those words back into our vocabulary so that we can learn them more quickly. If you just are only accessing things one time and then going on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, you have a harder task ahead of you. What you need to do is go back to the same things that you've already looked at over and over again in order to have that repetition and that recycling make your learning time less. You're counting on the fact that repetition builds structures in our brain, and we need to, just like using flashcards, we go back over the ones that we've already memorized, sometimes in order to remember, in order to recall them again and refresh that memory. So that's key, having a plan or a strategy. So we need to encourage that in our learners. Another part of that strategy is just to give people the opportunity to do self-assessment. So not only assessment of kinds of the learning objectives in your classroom, but also people need to have a clear idea about what they know, about where they are in their second language, and where they would like to go next. Part of this is around investigating things like I showed you, that GSE level, or that teacher toolkit shows you things that are supposedly at your level. It's also important to find things that are below your level and above your level, and to know where they are, when they're below, and when they're above your level. The reason that we access things below our level is because it's fun to look at something that's below your level and be able to understand it completely, or be able to perform the task really well and feel that sense of accomplishment, that you can recognize that you learned that, you did it really well, you were able to understand that, those 5 minutes of video so well that you felt it, you could even hear the echo in your brain. It's a great feeling. And so I would encourage people to look at things that are below their level sometimes, but also they have to have the target of things that are written for or spoken by native speakers of the language, or highly proficient non-native speakers, whatever it is. That has to be your target. Your target cannot be this artificial language that's typically included in classroom recordings or textbook recordings, or on websites that are intended for students, that are slowed down and simplified. Again, slowed down and simplified is good for some purposes, but you have to have the task of learning to be able to understand things that were intended for native speakers. In some cases, people didn't have this objective. They were just trying to struggle by and they would find shortcuts. So when I was teaching in Italy, I had a student show me his method of decoding English in order to remember the spelling correctly, because spelling was very important for them, excuse me, in those classes. So he would remember the words "made in USA" by pronouncing it in the Italian phonology, "made in USA." So it's useful as a short-term fix for learning how to spell things and memorizing spelling, which we know English spelling is kind of crazy. It's a bad habit to rely on, because then you begin to use that as a reflex, and you no longer process things in the way that they actually might be spoken in English, with sounds blended together with the unusual phonology and spelling of English. So people avoid the hard task by finding a shortcut, and that shortcut can be very, very detrimental or ineffective for people who really need to break into the real language. So they need to see native speaker English as a target that they can achieve understanding and reading, and participating in a conversation in that way. The next part is about deliberate practice. Excuse me. Deliberate means thoughtful and conscious. So people need to know, as learners, what they're trying to learn. Again, having them just sit and poke around on YouTube and find things for 4 hours is not going to be useful, because it's not focused and it's not deliberate. People need to know what they're trying to do at any moment. So if you're watching a video, you might be trying to just understand the words and the sounds. You might be trying to stop them and then repeat them over and over again, either in your head subvocally, or actually practice that repetition vocally by imitating something that people said. You might be able to, you might be trying to just get the gist of something, just trying to get the main meaning and not understand every word and every sound. Those are very different tasks that are all based on the same material. So people need to, as learners, develop the self-awareness of what they are trying to do at one moment. If you try to do everything, you will actually be doing nothing. So you have to focus on specific things and break them down. And then later on, you can build them back up again to a more global task. As people are accessing material, they need to remember that they're doing this for a reason, because time on task is important, and they need to get 10,000 hours of time in if they're going to achieve something like a high C1 level in their target language. So they need, this quantity is a huge consideration in the psychological study of memory and learning. And we need to teach this to our students, that the 10,000 hours is their goal, and they've got to get there somehow. And mostly it's going to be by self-access and by taking control of their own learning, not by allowing teachers or textbooks to dictate how they spend their time. And again, massive repetition. Now, repetition, I've already given some examples of it. Is important. It's probably not very important in your classroom, because we've tried this in the past. It's not a good way to spend 45 minutes. This is something that you do on your own. It's something that you do because listening to the same material, if it's rich material that was produced for and by native speakers, has an infinite depth to it, and you can listen to it over and over again and still find things to learn in it. Just like when I was studying Japanese or learning Japanese when I was in Japan, I didn't really study, but I used to watch soap operas in Japanese, and I would watch the same episodes over and over and over again. Sometimes somebody would help me understand it. Sometimes one of my neighbors would help me understand why people were expressing things the way that they were. Sometimes the language was too fast and I couldn't hear it. But after you hear it 15 or 20 times, you begin to actually hear it. So that repetition is something that probably does not belong in the classroom, because we know it's a huge amount of time, and it's boring for everybody at the same time. But students need to know that that repetition, when it's smart repetition, should be incorporated into their learning. Finally, the testing effect is something that psychologists have discovered, which is really just it's a recall of material that you've already learned supports all the other material that was in the same domain. So this is really not about testing. This is about asking people to remember things and produce them again. So the more that you produce things that are from the same textbook, the more that you remember the other things that you also learned in that textbook, even the things that you're not being quizzed on or tested on at that moment. It's a very strong effect. It's much stronger than actually studying. So I encourage you to look up this effect. Mark McDaniel is the psychologist who's most well known around the research of this. And it's a fascinating idea of, it's kind of like flashcards, where you're recalling things and trying to remember them. And even when you're looking at things that are only on a specific domain, that learning supports all of the other learning around it. We need to get learners to focus on the key areas in the second language. And so this is sort of my opinion, but I think, as I've already mentioned earlier, that listening and pronunciation are the keys to second language learning, especially at the early levels. Because we need to break into the system. If we focus too much on decoding the spoken word, we can get to a high point of vocabulary and grammar and maybe even reading ability, like often students do, who don't have a lot of contact with English. However, they will never understand English fluently or automatically. They won't have good pronunciation and won't have the effect that when you have good pronunciation, speakers, the people who are talking to you, who might be native speakers of that language, will give you better input because they think you're better in English than you are. So if you have good pronunciation, you will have much better interactions and get more input and will make progress in the language faster. If people perceive your pronunciation as being very poor, they will give you only like teacher talk or foreigner talk, and you will never get the input that you need to really train your brain with those many thousands of hours to parse and understand input at a native speaker pronunciation and level, speed. So those are key. The phonological system is key, and I think often in language classrooms, we've focused on textbooks and on written word because it's easier. but we really need to help people understand the idea that listening and pronunciation are absolutely tied to their ultimate attainment in the second language. Vocabulary is another area. We need people to study more and more vocabulary and self-access materials so that they can develop an understanding of, so that they can further their understanding of English vocabulary. Just the textbook vocabulary is not going to be enough for them. They need at least 2,000 words to be functional in English. And finally, strategic competence. This is about kind of understanding what I can do as a learner, how I can understand if I'm learning, if I'm getting anything out of this situation or this activity. If not, what can I do about it to change it? And so this is about just developing the consciousness of a lifelong learner. And it's not about language per se. I would say the less focus areas are the areas to spend much less focus on as leaders in learning are around accuracy. I don't really care about accuracy as a teacher most of the time because I'm trying to focus on developing communicative competence and fluency and a kind of like automaticity of some parts of the language, getting closer and closer to that. Memorizing grammar rules and memorizing correctness is not really going to get us there. We've tried that before. We know it doesn't work. Please give it up for most of your lessons. And also learning the content, studying content for a grade or for passing a test, for these kinds of functions where we are evaluating somebody and giving them a score. We know that even this is not enough to motivate people to actually learn effectively. That's not going to work. So I would focus more on these other areas. And finally, formal assessment. Now, we've talked about self-assessment, which is very important as a learner. Formal assessment is another source of information about our level of proficiency. So if if you're in a textbook that says you're at the B1 level and you're getting 80, 90, 100% correct on your tests at the end of each chapter, this gives you the impression that you are at the B1 level. It would be important to check that with another test that actually is on a standardized scale that can give us a sense of our true proficiency. We don't move very linearly from one proficiency level to the next in many cases in a second language. So we can't expect that, that it's going to track exactly with what the textbook says we are. We need that kind of external measure of our proficiency level to understand truly where we are. And it also helps us reflect on what effects our learning practices are having on our learning and on our proficiency over time. So I spent a lot of time doing these things. I check my proficiency at the beginning and at the end. I can see that those did not increase my proficiency. So I need to reflect on whether or not that was a problem with the practice that I engaged in, or whether it just wasn't enough time, or whether maybe I need to focus on a different area for the future. So this gives us a sense of where our proficiency is in correlation with some kind of standard measure. So it's very important. And I'll talk a little bit about, Pearson has some automatically scored language tests that can be given to students as they're at home, on a computer, on a mobile device. And this is not just written, but it's also speaking and listening, reading and writing. It's on everyday topics. And so we have a number of tests that we can administer that measure production. And as I said, they're automatically scored. So considering the price of these, I would say they're very cheap for getting a score in under an hour, in some cases within minutes. That would give you a sense of where you are on some standardized scales. So one of the brands of these tests is called Verson. We measure all 4 skills in these tests and score them automatically using artificial intelligence. We give a score report. So this is an example score report from the Verson 4 Skills Essential Test. It gives an overall score. That's an average of speaking, listening, reading, and writing. It gives detailed description of what people can do at this level, and it gives suggestions for improvement and a mapping of those scores onto the global scale of English as well as the CEFR. And finally, it has the capability of remote proctoring or remote monitoring. So if you're giving these tests to your students, you can also enable this system so that you can make sure that they're not cheating, that they are that they appear to be giving a good faith effort on the test and not doing things that would be considered cheating or inappropriate behavior. These tests are all available to you. So finally, I'd like to mention that, just in conclusion, first of all, self-access learning is it's inevitable. It's essential. It's the way that you get to that 10,000 hours. It's not just fooling around. It's actually useful and very, very effective for learning in many cases if that practice is planned and documented and deliberate and focused. Tools like that teacher toolkit that I showed you are one way for you to develop curriculum and lesson plans for your students, or to have them develop their own learning plans based on their own interests. And these are free and easy to use systems that go way beyond what dictionaries and encyclopedias and class and textbooks used to do. Certainly, as I mentioned, speaking is not quite where we would like it to be. The automated practice and testing systems for speaking are kind of in their beginning, but I think within our lifetimes, we're going to see dramatic advances in this area, and soon we will sort of have that artificially intelligent kind of robot who doesn't get tired, who gives us the feedback that we need, who doesn't judge us and make us feel bad about the way that we speak, and who gives us the opportunity to engage in a lot of communication and repetition. And I think for me, this is a little bit of the dream of speaking practice that we can not achieve through only classrooms. And so this doesn't mean that teachers and administrators are losing their jobs because of these systems. Actually, we need you to help students develop all of these skills and become lifelong learners and access the systems effectively and spend that 90% of their outside time in ways that's actually supporting their learning. So that's where your leadership comes in. So we have a few minutes for questions, and I'd like to thank you very much for your time today, and I appreciate you tuning in and listening. I'm not sure if, Jen, are you there? Let's see. Welcome, I'm just looking at some questions. Okay, so how can we motivate our learners to manage their own learning? I think motivating, we can't give motivation to people. What we can do is show them how much their own self-access practices can be fulfilling for them, can be effective at them learning new things, and get that feeling of accomplishment is very important. So we can't give people motivation, but we have to encourage them to try things themselves. Now, as I said, I worked as a language teacher for 15 years, and I know in some cases you have learners that are not motivated. I don't have an answer to that question. I vowed that if I were trying to teach learners who were not motivated, then I was not going to take on that responsibility of trying to motivate them. I think people have to learn to be self-motivated and learn to be motivated to learn things that are important to them. So if we are forcing people to learn things that they are not really trying to learn, that I recognize it. I did it myself. It's a very difficult situation to be in as a teacher, and I don't really have a great answer for that. I am getting, let's see, I have a question here. At high levels of education, what can we do with students who get stuck and who can't go further regarding improving English, especially pronunciation? I think, okay, so pronunciation is a particular problem. We often don't have the resources or the expertise to